When we look at the age band for adolescents, the 10 to 19-year-olds, we realize that actually these are made up of quite two very different age groups. We've got early adolescents, which is the age 10 to 14, but also the older adolescents, 15 to 19. And there's a lot going on during that time. And there are other categorizations of that, sort of looking at pre-adolescence, early adolescence, middle and late. But I think it's safe to say that they're not a homogeneous group. And they're really going through a journey. And there's a lot of neurodevelopmental issues going on, logical and moral thinking, a greater sense of self-awareness, need for social cohesion, but also riskier behavior. And it's a time when logical reasoning is playing catch-up with change. And so we need to think about different considerations to these adolescents depending on age as they progress through this time. And when thinking about sexual behavior and intimacy, we have to remember that a 10-year-old is very different from a 19-year-old. They're different in their ability to consent to medical services or treatment. They're different in terms of their ability to ask for contraception or other HIV or sexual and reproductive health services. They're also very different in terms of the age of consent. And the age of consent, as you'll see later on, varies quite a lot across the sub-Saharan African region, as does the legal age of marriage. And therefore, logical reasoning within these groups are very different at these different stages of development. It's also a time of navigating a multitude of risk factors. And Helen showed us this morning this slide, which really shows that they're dealing with a lot of other health issues and a lot of other risks. And in the sub-Saharan African region, many of the countries are actually classified as multi-burden diseases, multi-burden countries. And also, as highlighted this morning, HIV amongst this group remains one of the leading causes of death. In South Africa, it's estimated that the number of new infections per week amongst young women and girls aged 15 to 24 is 1,745 infections a week. That's an astounding number. So we can't deny that adolescents are sexually active. And in fact, if you look at this DHS data from a number of countries, on the percentage of adolescents aged 15 to 19 who've had sexual intercourse before the age of 15, you'll see, both for the girls and for the boys, that there are substantial substantial proportion of young people who are sexually active very early, and there are a number of factors that are associated with that, which I won't go into just now. And if we look at our data from the South African Demographic and Health Survey for 2016, we also see that the sexual behavior is very different for males and females. And so, if you look at sexual activity in the last 12 months, about 40% of young women and men report being sexually active, with a higher proportion of young men saying that they use condoms. Where you really start seeing the differences in the multiple sexual partners, with young men reporting much higher rates of having sex with multiple partners, and with much higher number of mean number of sexual partners. And these engagements can be risky for young people. So this is data from the National Youth Risk Behaviour Survey here, and this is for girls younger than 15 in South Africa. And you can see that about a quarter of them reported having 2 or more partners, but you also see the use of alcohol and drugs before sex. And we're seeing here also the outcomes of some of that risky behavior in terms of young people reporting that they have been pregnant. And if you look at an even younger age group, more than, and this is girls aged 10 to 19, about a third reported that they'd ever had sex. 12% said that they had had sex before the age of 14, and in this, in our context, that falls into the category of child sexual assault. 14% of these young girls had their own child, but also a large proportion said that they had sought an abortion at a hospital or at a traditional leader, at a traditional healer. So adolescents have very complex circumstances that often overlap. They're not only heterogeneous in terms of what's going on in the different age groups, but also they could be in school. They're not all heterosexual. Some of them have been sexually abused. Some may be married early, in and out of school. Female genital mutilation is an issue in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are a number of factors that really influence how sex happens, and these circumstances can often overlap and may expose them to even more significant risks. So let's talk a little bit about intimacy. So this is a confusing concept, and particularly for young people, and it's more than just being close or two people feeling like they belong together, and very different from sexual activity, although not unrelated. And if you look at definitions for intimacy, the definitions talk about a quality of a relationship in which individuals have reciprocal feelings of trust, feel emotionally close towards one another, and are able to openly communicate their thoughts and feelings. And intimacy is important because emotional intimacy is vital in constructions of fulfilled sexuality. There's a lot of literature around intimacy leading to increased sexual satisfaction, and high-quality satisfactory relationships and sexual intimacy are well documented in terms of their positive impact on physical and mental health. So intimacy is good, but how does it affect the fastest growing population? For many young people, first sexual encounters are often reported to be forced. So that first sexual encounter may not be intimate for many young people. In some settings, almost half of adolescent girls report that their first sexual experience was forced. And there's a growing body of literature that suggests that the younger the age of sexual debut, the more likely a young girl is that their first sexual experience is coerced or forced. And the prevalence of coerced and forced sexual initiation ranges widely in sub-Saharan Africa, but is sadly quite common. And this violence prevents women from influencing the circumstances of how sex happens, and possibly results in more frequent sex and less protected sex. So consent for young people, it's hard for young people to understand if no one explained it to you. So this is data from the Terence Higgins Trust, and it's they surveyed in the UK 900 young people, and the vast majority of whom were not taught about consent. So if you're not taught about consent and it's a hard thing for you to understand, I think that's one of the issues that came up from the young people in the UK was that the sexuality education focused a lot on STIs and pregnancies and what's going to happen if you have unsafe sex, but it didn't talk about relationships and consent and some of the things that young people really want to know about and grapple with. I mentioned earlier the age of consent varying across Africa, but you can see here that it varies widely, and in some places, girls as young as 12 are seen as legally able to consent. And marriage is not any different. So the legal age of marriage varies dramatically across the continent, but it doesn't really mean very much, particularly in conflict and in poverty. And what we see is that there's a large number of young girls that are married before the age of 18 every year, which puts them also at risk of other negative outcomes of having sex when they're very young or having babies when they're very young. According to Plan International, 43% of girls in Kenya were married before the age of 18. And in developing countries, 1 in every 3 girls is married before they reach the age of 18. What's quite shocking is the last bullet point is 1 in 9 is married under the age of 15. And why is that important in terms of sexual behaviour? When you look at data from Uganda, and this is also seen in Ethiopia, that when you look at married girls reporting having sex versus never married girls, that you see that the married girls all report being sexually active versus the never married girls. And often that sex is happening with an older partner. So what about intimacy in those instances? Adolescent girls who married early are often the victims of intimate partner violence, and this is really sort of the flip side of intimacy. Intimate partner violence is a reality for many women, but particularly for young married adolescents, this is really a huge issue. And available data suggests that ever married adolescent girls and young women aged 15 to 19 years are most affected by spousal or physical violence. I'd also like to share a bit of data from an intervention that we're doing in Kailicha and in Johannesburg in schools. And we've just been interviewing young boys and girls between grade 8 and 10. So these are 12 to 17-year-olds. And as early as 12 to 17-year-old, you can see that young boys, out of the 349 young boys that we've interviewed, 20% reported hitting their partner when they did something wrong. And a third of them reported forcing themselves onto someone that they were interested in dating. We're also seeing a little bit of boys also reporting violence from partners. So about 3% of young boys reported experiencing violence from a partner. Of the girls, out of the girls, 2% experienced violence from a partner. And you must remember that these are sort of peer age groups, so the girls are probably having partnerships with boys who are older than that age group. So sex for young people doesn't always mean intimacy. It can be forced. There's sex work, survival sex, transactional sex, and I'll touch on that later on, and early marriage. So there are a lot of things that really feed into why sex happens and the circumstances within which sex happens for young people, and it's not always to do with intimacy. And even consensual sex may not necessarily be intimate, but intimacy is well documented to increase sexual satisfaction. So can we measure intimacy? I mentioned earlier on that it's quite a complex construct. And so it can be, in the literature, it has been examined using mainly couples, older couples, as a unit of analysis, and looking at kind of domains around emotional intimacy, sexual satisfaction, satisfaction with the relationship, but kind of an underlying theme is communication as a key influencing factor. Some studies focus on self-reported communication behaviours such as self-disclosure and empathetic responsiveness from the partner, and others look at spousal appraisal of partners' communication patterns. But these studies have been done in older couples. What about young people's perspectives on intimate relationships? In a study in rural South Africa, 18 to 19-year-olds described their relationships as being serious, but some saw it as passing time, something temporary. The majority felt the need to complete secondary school and to find a job before entering into a serious relationship. And again, if we look at the gap year data, across girls and boys, about 70% of them described their relationship as serious, with about a third of both boys and girls saying that it was a casual relationship. So worries about intimacy and dating. So young women and young men are confused about new emotions that they're experiencing during puberty, and are curious about changes they observe in terms of social dynamics between the sexes. And they sense that there's some kind of code of behavior for these interactions, but they get a little bit frustrated because they don't understand it. But at the same time, they want that intimacy. They're worried about being isolated and lonely. And if they don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but they feel uncertain about how to behave around the opposite sex and how to become intimate with a partner, it can be even more of a confusing time. So what does it mean to young people? So a study conducted amongst young people, 16 to 18-year-olds in the Western Cape, asked young people about moments of intimacy and intimate behaviours. And what they found was that it's very similar to adult discourses of intimacy. Adolescents valued and they sought out opportunities to be alone together, to talk about themselves and their relationships. And these opportunities gave them a strong mutual sense of closeness, of being together, the physical activities of spending time together, preferably alone and talking. So moving to influencers, and I won't go into too many details about this because I believe my colleague will also be talking about, Sinead will speak in more details about some of these determinants. But I think the point I want to make is that alcohol amongst young adolescents is really a prevalent issue and results in impaired judgment, usually associated with high-risk sexual behaviours and unprotected sex. And peer pressure also plays into that. So the desire to impress friends or to conform to perceived norms might be an important driver of sexual initiation or multiple partnerships amongst young people, particularly males. In our cohort, 21% of girls felt pressure to have sex from either friends, that was the vast majority, or partners, or even relatives and parents. And this is coming up quite consistently, is the role of parents. And we haven't spoken about it much in the previous talks, but they are really key influencers of young people, and I think it would be really helpful to talk about what kinds of interventions and what kind of work and information we need to do with parents. In university students, studies from the higher education aides indicated that about 14% of college students were involved in transactional sex for money or goods. And young women were seeing that as quite a positive thing. They mention a wide range of items that were exchanged or purchased with proceeds from transactional sex activities. So here are two quotes. "Come the 15th of the month, payday for provincial government employees, he gives me his bank card to go and buy myself a new outfit or a pair of sneakers from Sports Scene." The second young lady says, "He can buy me something to wear when the two of us are going out. He won't want me to be seen looking snacks, ugly, when I'm going with him, you see." But sex is also fun, and it feels good. And a literature review found that adolescents may not view initiating sex as problematic, focusing instead on the rewards they perceive sex brings and less on the health concerns. But adolescents are having sex, but beyond this, I think we and the programmers, academics, and the researchers, and everyone in the room need to understand sex from an adolescent perspective. Brace yourself. So, social media has been a bit of a double-edged sword. So social media platforms are said to increase adolescents' connectedness with their peers. They might facilitate the pursuit of sexual relationships. A study with Mixit users across South Africa found that the most commonly reported topic of conversation was love life and dating. But on the flip side, several studies have also identified the internet as an STI risk environment amongst those seeking partners online, and concerns have been raised about that social media might actually create opportunities for sexual experimentation and expose adolescents to sexually explicit material. Certainly we're hearing in the schools that we work with that young people are using their cell phones to access pornography and to try and sort of play out some of what they see. They are curious and hungry for specific information. So the National Department of Health runs a Mobi site which provides information and resources for young people. The most read article by adolescent followers on the Mobi site is Masturbation and Orgasm, Touch and Play. So in terms of social media, young people can be loud, but also sincere. And their feelings are very real. And they use Facebook often as a forum for disclosure that's independent of their psychosocial status, without thinking maybe about the broader ramifications of having that information out in the social media. Adolescents who are often treated as adults fail to have a mature understanding of the potential harm that disclosure could have on their well-being. In summary, I'd like to just make a few points and then highlight some gaps. Adolescents form a significant and growing population, particularly in the sub-Saharan African region. They're a diverse group with multiple different vulnerabilities. They engage in early sex and risky sex, and their sex is not always consensual and it's not always intimate. But intimacy is a complex construct. There's widespread recognition that early adolescence has been a neglected area in both research and action. And I think while I was sort of doing the literature review, trying to prepare for this talk, there's really a dearth of literature around particularly the early adolescence. Yet it's a critical period when understandings of gender equality become embedded, and it's an opportunity to engage adolescents in critiquing ideas about their gender equality and sexual rights. And we're seeing very young people already experiencing and perpetrating violence. Social media and online adolescent behaviour is an online resource that could potentially inform future research. And I was quite interested in some of the discussion this morning around the potential for that. But there's a paucity of interventions and literature addressing intimacy in young relationships, despite adolescents having the same sexual and reproductive rights as adults. The right to information, education, free choice of a partner, consensual relationships, a satisfying, safe and pleasurable sex life. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I seem to have put that there twice. But there's also a need to address the legal frameworks that might drive risk for adolescents. And particularly, I'm referring to issues around the age of consent and age of marriage in many countries. We need to find alternative ways to deal with sex education, healthy sex and sexuality, and sexual and reproductive health without problematizing sex. And to promote risk reduction and effective prevention. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at WITS RHI and the adolescents that inspire us. Thank you.